Diving Deeper Discussions. I'm your host, Randy Ising, here on behalf of the American Scientific Affiliation. We're here to discuss publications in Perspectives on Science and Christian Faith, which is the journal of the ASA. And today we begin our discussion of the March 2024 issue. The lead article in this issue has the title, The Irreducible Novelty of Chemistry in Natural History. And we're delighted to have the author with us today, Ben McFarland. Welcome, Ben.
All right. Thanks, Randy. It's great to be here.
All right. So, Ben, I don't know how many people in this audience are familiar with you. You haven't been on this program before. And so let's start with a little bit of discussion of where you are. I think it says here, and we all know that you're Seattle Pacific right now, but let's dig a little bit farther back. Where were you born and raised?
Well, I was born in Phoenix, Arizona, but we moved. Formative years all took place when we moved to Florida. My dad got a job on the Space Coast. So we were in Brevard County, right where they launched the shuttles from. And I was actually involved in that whole scientific aerospace kind of world from early on. And of course, I also learned early on that it's not necessarily a perfect world. 1986, I was out on my schoolyard watching the Challenger get launched with the first teacher in space. So I actually saw that historical event with my own eyes. And that's...
Oh, my.
Yeah, it's one of those things that really sort of shaped me as I went through. After that,
You mean, wait a minute, you actually saw it happen?
Yes. It's a really big county, and so it was far away. And when you're seeing something that you don't expect to see, your brain doesn't process it right, especially if you're a sixth grader. I didn't realize that anything was wrong until the teachers herded us inside and turned on the TV. And we just had one of those days where you just watch the TV for the rest of it. But of course, for the next couple years, there was economic fallout for our entire county. We had, my dad lost his job. And so I experienced a lot of instability early on, and I think it's a bit of the way the world works. I mean, when you're in Florida, you kind of have Disney World as kind of the perfect way the world's supposed to work. And this is sort of a corrective to that. But it really helped me to see that there are things that are more important than the superficial things. And it really shaped me on a pretty deep level, probably.
I would think so, yeah. So where did you go to college?
Went to University of Florida, and I actually didn't intend to stay in science when I started there. I actually have 2 degrees from a College of Journalism in public relations, but that's technical communications. And then I have a chemistry degree because I kept liking the chemistry and I kept doing it. And only when I was in my senior year did I find out they would pay you to go to grad school. Not much, but you'd be able to... You wouldn't be paying them, I guess, is the main way to put it.
Right.
And so
it's a big difference.
I decided to go to grad school. Yeah.
Yeah. So do you think the connection with the space industry was a strong factor in your interest in chemistry?
It was definitely tied together with it. I always had a class called science research, and started in 7th grade. I started to take that class. And I was able to take it every year, where you put together a science project. It was a whole class for putting together a science project. And so I did that 6 years in a row, all the way through high school. And so I didn't realize it, but I was really becoming a scientist without thinking I was becoming a scientist. I was just sort of taking the class, and it came sort of straightforwardly to me. So I kept doing it because it kept working for me. And
so you just did what you enjoyed, and that happened to be
that was it's part of that. And it wasn't, I mean, there are certain stresses that come with it. You have to come up with a project, and it's a more stressful class in some ways than others. But once I got the hang of it, it actually was just kind of like, well, let's just keep doing this. And I developed an analytical sense, I found out that I was looking at the world like a scientist without really intending to. So it wasn't that intentional. One day I looked up and said, hey, this chemistry thing is working for me. Hey,
cool.
this chemistry. Let's keep doing it,
Yeah.
and let's see where it.
So you graduated from U of Florida with a major in chemistry and something in technical writing.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. And you went on to grad school right away?
Yes, I looked at a bunch of grad schools and eventually decided on University of Washington. They had a cool interdisciplinary program, and I came there and I finished my PhD 5 years, and then I took a postdoctoral appointment at the Fred Hutchinson Cancer Research Center.
Really interesting. And from that, it led to Seattle Pacific.
Right. That was directly where I came into. Actually, I was always wanting to teach at a small Christian liberal arts college because, that's just, I didn't want to do the R01. Probably my tendency not to be an R01 research scientist, which shows up from the very beginning with my attitude toward the science. I wanted to, I basically just wanted to do it in a certain way, and I wanted to teach.
Right.
That's what I'm really called to, I feel like, and that's what I do at SPU. So yeah, I ended up headed in that direction. I always knew we've always had a connection to SPU. I met my wife when I came up to Seattle. We met in church choir. She was the accompanist, and I was a singer returning to choir after an absence. And then then our kids sing in the church choir. So music is a big part of our lives.
Right. So let's talk a little bit about your faith background then.
Yeah,
so you grew up in a Christian family and stayed in the faith, or come to it later, or how did that work out?
Yeah, I pretty much actually, if I think about it, the whole Challenger disaster occurred at about the same time that there were a lot of scandals involving televangelists. But again, that's a bad thing, for the church as a whole. It's, it was a negative thing. But it also sort of set me up so that I don't think I ever really had like a crisis of faith moment, because I saw what was real and what was fake already mixed up in the church, kind of like wheat and tares, I suppose. And so it didn't surprise me later on. And also, the connection to music has always been an important connection to me. And I found a lot of music that really sort of sustained me through all the changes that happen when you're in college and things like that. So, I've changed denominations, I've changed churches as we've moved, but I do feel like the path that God has led me on has been leading through music, and it's always been there,
Yes, right. So let's get back to the chemistry then. What was your focus in chemistry? I mean, what was your specialty within chemistry?
Well, I was actually in a program. The program that I chose to go through was called Biomolecular Structure and Design. And I like the idea of design. I always thought about things structurally. I love these big pictures that you can do of the proteins and things like that. I like seeing the atoms, And so I kept moving through that. And I also felt like you could do some good with this science if you were called to develop something that would heal people. So I thought that was a good application of my love for chemistry as you were teaching as well. So I specialized in immune protein structure, and that was my grad school research as well as my postdoc. And I continued to carry those over. It's actually still, in a sense, I've moved molecules a lot, just like I've changed churches, right? But I'm still working on immune protein structure today.
Okay, excellent. That's great. So now let's get a little more specific in terms of this particular article that we're discussing today. What are the factors that led you to be interested in this particular topic?
It was actually teaching a physical chemistry class, if I want to trace it all the way back. And actually, the ASA, there's an ASA meeting that plays a role in this. So I don't want to tell the whole story, but I'm assigned to teach a physical chemistry class. It's actually for our BA rather than our BS students. And so it needed to have less math and more interdisciplinary connections. And as I was doing that, I was trying to struggle with how am I going to teach this thing that's not in the center of what I do. I found out that I love it, and it's really great way to look at the world. At the time, same time, there was the joint ASA meeting with the UK version of the ASA. I forget their name.
Christians in Science?
Yes. And there was a meeting, and it was over in the UK. I couldn't go, but Alistair McGrath spoke at that meeting. And he mentioned at the end of his ASA talk, I can probably still go find it today, that there's this chemist named R.J.P. Williams, and he has this idea for how chemistry shaped biology, and somebody should look into it, who's a Christian, think it through theologically. And so I was like, well, let me look it up. And I basically got into R.J.P. Williams, and I found out that that fit with my physical chemistry teaching. So I took his ideas and I taught them to my students in the context of physical chemistry. Then I looked up one day, SPU has an award lecture where they want people to speak about their discipline. And I'm like, why don't I speak about this? Then I was like, why don't I write a book about this? And then, but the whole thing is the theological dimension. When I got the book out, it was actually supported by a grant from Biologos back in 2014. And so that helped me write the book. It got accepted by Oxford University Press, but the whole point of the book was for it to be targeted at a general popular science audience. And so I did deal with that. I do explicitly say where I'm coming from in the author's note in the book. And I do mention things. I think it shapes everything that I say in the book, but I don't know if I mentioned the word God explicitly, precisely because the audience that I'm writing the book for won't have the same definition of the word God that I do when I say, and it would be a barrier. So I wanted to start with the science and sort of lead up to the more theological and philosophical implications with that book. I was always, I dealt with the whole idea, am I hiding who I am, by coming out and saying in a few places, this is who I am. I'm a Christian. I'm actually talking about this because I believe that God is real and God made it. And I'm trying to work out what that means. But I was always a little bit like, because of the audience concerns, I wanted to write something that would be like a theological companion to the book. And so it never happened. The book's now come out in 2016, so it's now 8 years old. But finally, when we had the call for papers that was put out about chemistry, I was like, why don't I try to see if this can kind of come together? So if it seems a little bit packed together, the writing article, it's probably because it's trying to summarize what a whole book is doing.
Right. And now we should say that the title of that book was A World from Dust, right? That's the one you're talking about.
Right. How the periodic table shaped life. And so it definitely has a chemistry focus, and it's about how chemists think. And it's sort of R.J.P. Williams for the masses, it's that kind of thing, because his ideas, his books they took me forever to read and work through. But part of my thing as a teacher is I read and work through something, and then I give it to my students. And so it's come out to be, and I still use some of those concepts. I actually assigned my book to my physical chemistry class today, and we read through it.
Cool. Well, in fact, it kind of leads to what our first submitted question was, but I don't see Steve Leninger in the participant list. Unless you're here under a different pseudonym or something. But actually, he submitted more of a comment or a rhetorical question than he says, don't you think that chemistry majors should be required to take a course in geology using your book? Right. I presume you're going to say yes to that one.
Well, I think that all of us as teachers should try to incorporate other disciplines into our courses. It helps you to learn. It challenges you, and you get stuff wrong. There's a few places in my book that were wrong because I was sort of reaching out of my comfort zone. But that's not the end of the world. You just got to be able to say, hey, I was wrong about that, and now I'm learning something new.
Well, but if you didn't have something in your book that was wrong, it might be the first book in the world.
That's true. That's true.
There's something in there. So that's cool. Okay, so let's get into the thick of things. Let's get the discussion rolling. But let's open the microphones, Becky, and let's turn to our next submitted question, which I think is a perfect one to start the discussion, and that's Del Kuhn. And he's got a really fundamental question here. So we've been discussing a little bit about how to phrase this. So Del, let's give it a try.
Okay, I'll try. Thanks, Randy. And thanks for the article, Ben. I appreciated reading it, and I actually enjoyed going back and reviewing some of my background on Charles Sanders Peirce. So question, I'm looking for clarification on a couple of things by irreducible novelty. Should I be thinking of something like the properties of salt wouldn't be expected from elemental sodium and elemental chlorine, and then more or less building on that, I'm thinking an analogy to Stephen Jay Gould's Wonderful Life. If the tape of evolution were replayed, it would become something different. Are you thinking of a parallel with that in the chemical and mineral world, that, say, a different system for electron transfer, like maybe based on sulfur, or a different set of bases to convey the genetic code, and all the other possible myriad differences in a cell's chemistry could go on. So really looking for clarification, and please try to answer in more than 25 words or less.
Thank you. Thank you. I don't think 25 words or less comes close to scratching the surface for this kind of question. This is really actually one of the things I was asking myself as I was going through the whole thing, as I was writing this. And like I said, I had sabbatical when I was working on this, and that was really good because I was able to focus and really ask myself, what's the good of this? What is the point of the term? It's not a mathematical term, right? But it's something above the mathematical in some senses. It's something beyond the mathematical, and yet maybe does it have a mathematical expression that we can quantify it in any ways? It does start with the idea that there is something different about sodium and chlorine together than there is about them apart, or even there is about them dissolved in water versus in the crystalline form. Something happens when things relate to each other, and it is a fundamentally relational thing. It's not a pinpointed, quantifiable thing necessarily, but it's more about the relationship between them. And it does start, Joseph Earley has a lot of good examples about how this can emerge from structures when you bring two things together, and a new meaning emerges. And that led to the whole idea about, how does this relate to the ideas of emergence and things like that? And then you can move it to processes in time, not just structures in space. The processes in time relates to how natural history changed and evolved over time, and the idea that new things came about that were genuinely new. And I think that what the term irreducible novelty gets us is not a probabilistic argument, not something that you can add up. At the very least, it's always going to include the units of time and the units of irreversibility. Once something happens, we can't turn back time. And so there's all sorts of philosophical ideas that people are struggling with. But irreducible novelty is sort of like what the church has always been here. We've always been sort of struggling with how to put the natural world together and how to put classical philosophy of like Plato and Aristotle on down together with our the revealed truth of the scriptures of Genesis and the Gospels and Jesus Christ on every page and things like that. And I guess one of the realizations with irreducible novelty is that you can bring in categories from this classical tradition of classical theism, of how Christians have done this before. And there's some ways to bring in those categories, which include, they're summarized up as the transcendentals: truth, beauty, and goodness. But also one of the things I found out is that there's other transcendentals as well. It's not just those three. But we can go back to these very old ideas, and we can kind of bring them into newness by thinking about them again and applying them to our current knowledge and our current the unfolding of science that brings us back to this. I feel like the church has always done this. It's why we have classical theism in the first place, because the church fathers were sort of working with bringing in these ideas from philosophy, bringing it together. Thomas Aquinas worked with Aristotle, things like that. So in a sense, I think we're still called to do that today. Irreducible Novelty says when we look at science, or when we think about it with philosophy, when we interpret the science, that there's something genuinely different and new that we can recognize. I think the other part of irreducible novelty, why it's a useful term to me, is because it speaks to that mind is at home in the universe, that we were made to see this novelty that comes about. That's not really reducible. If we take the novelty apart, it disappears in some way. When we recognize it, whether it's as a species or a new chemical type, the chemotype is the idea that R.J.P. Williams did. When he sort of recognized a chemotype, his mind was aligning with the universe. What do we do with that? And to me, that's a positive approach to the relationship between science and faith. It says that there are some things when we recognize something and our mind helps us understand the universe better, how new things came about. And that seems beautiful, true, transcendental to us. The idea is that our minds are aligning with matter in a way that they're made to do. The science works so well because it's been created by a creator who made things according to an order and a logos, but also gave his creation freedom to be able to, and there are things that are beyond us that seem disordered as well. So struggling with all these things about where we are in the universe, it really comes down to our mind can recognize novelty, and it's a genuinely new thing, and that is what God made us to do. So when we recognize that, we shouldn't dismiss it as just like, oh, it just happened to come together like that, and our minds developed from the universe, so they recognize the universe because they're part of the universe. But that leads to all sorts of problems about the mind seems so different than the universe. And so when I've looked into the church fathers and things like that, they were struggling with the whole idea of what is the soul? Do souls pre-exist, like Plato said? Or and what happens to the soul at the end as we're becoming more like Christ? And this actually was bringing science and faith together for them. So I think they're categories of the transcendentals and the beauty of irreducible novelty. When I react that way to chemistry, it is sort of like the way that they reacted when they saw something that went along with Plato, but went along with the logos and gave glory to God in that way. So it's really about mind and matter, I think. It's really about feeling at home at the universe and feeling like God made us to understand and to feel these reactions of truth, beauty, and goodness, that there's something real down there because God made us this way.
Okay. Del, you want to pursue any of that or come back to it later?
I appreciate it. I'd rather come back to it. I'd rather come back to it later and see what some of the other comments and interactions are. So I'm happy with that answer, and I may or may not be back later.
Yeah.
And I'm processing every answer that I give is necessarily definitely incomplete, but right. I feel like this is a grand challenge, and in a sense, it's kind of what the ASA is built to do, for us to try to recognize God's hand in creation.
Yeah, and I know somebody told me the article was hard to read, and I'll just say that it well repays as reading in as much detail as you can.
Well, I'll second that. Reading it the second, third times are valuable, and I'll need to read it a few more. And I've got a few questions later on, but let's move on to open the microphone to others. Again, those were the only submitted questions in advance. So again, as some of you have already done, if you would like to make a comment or ask a question, go to the reactions section, and within the reactions icon somewhere down in the bottom, click on raise hand, and we'll let you ask your question as in the order in which you raise your hand. And the first one to do that was Fred Cannon. Hello, Fred. Why don't you unmute yourself and go ahead and ask your question?
Hey, Randy, Ben, I remember meeting you at my first ASA meeting, and I purchased your book.
Okay, there's the proof.
A World from Dust.
Like through the air. Did I? I'll sign it someday. So
you did sign it. You did sign it.
All right.
That's Mike Art's book. And by the way, I'm going to be at the Ben BioLogos conference and this next week, and unless you guys disagree, I'll present both of your books as ones that people can see. I'll be at the ASA table at BioLogos. So.
Depends on how much commission you charge.
$0 commission. Yeah.
Yes.
All right. Okay, go ahead, Fred.
Yeah.
So A World from Dust, and the word for dust in Hebrew is afar. And that word has a lot of meanings, but one underlying meaning. So it's used to talk about dust, like that your feet would be on. It's used to talk about dust of leprosy. It's used to talk about flour ground up as small as afar. It's used to talk about the afar seed of Jacob. In other words, is how you reproduce. It's also used when they say that they ground up the cow, that everybody was worshiping.
The golden calf. Yeah.
As small as a far, and then they made people drink the gold of the golden calf. Well, so the thing we know about gold is it's about the heaviest element that people have access to. And to grind it up so small, and then it's in what people are drinking, means it's almost at the molecular level. Now you put all those uses together, and you have what you have in your book. Afar means really small stuff. Maybe we can't say that Moses and the authors understood, atoms, but they understood really small stuff. So from really small stuff you came to really small stuff you return is a way that we could think of this. What are your thoughts about that, Bim, as a chemist?
Yeah, the story of how the title came to be, originally when I wrote the proposal, it was called The Quickening. And then I decided to change it. That was a little too weird, so I changed it to River of Life. Then, of course, the publisher wanted to change it. I found out since you should always give sort of a dummy title to the publisher, because they will say no, and then they'll offer their suggestions, and then you can shape their suggestions. And so they said, come up with like 50 suggestions. And so I came up with them. And A World from Dust was on that list, and they actually liked it, and they brought it out. And so I didn't really think about all the implications of the word dust, even necessarily. I think this was after my manuscript was done, so I wasn't able to like go back and emphasize these things in it. But the idea, I really like it. I really like it because it does have the biblical resonance that you're talking about. And the very small things. One of the things, I think that Richard Middleton has said this, that the word dust is often associated with death. And so A World from Dust, to me, it says that very small things are brought together, like mustard seed would be another example of the very small things that you're talking about. On top of that, Adam was formed from the clay. I don't think that word is exactly dust, but I think the concept is similar. So the idea that we are formed from the dust, and dust you are, that's definitely appropriate as well.
Yeah, afar is used for Adam came from afar.
Right. Okay. So it is actually the word there. I like the idea that we are connected in that way, but also there's something different about us from the dust. It's a whole world. And when we look at the world, we see a whole world, although we came from dust, that points to something more. And the other application of dust is from death, God's work of giving life to things that look dead. And I kind of like how that goes with the whole theme of the book. And it has sort of a King James Bible level sort of illusion, but it's not straight out. I do get a lot of comments. It is kind of funny because, like I said, it's really a book written from an ASA type perspective, but it's written for a popular science bookshelf at Barnes and Noble. And one of the first reactions that people get is, what's up with the title? This doesn't say exactly what the book's about. You have to sort of dig into it. And I like that. It's the way that I like to write, so it represents me accurately as an author. I think that you should have to work a little bit sometimes, and you have to work a little bit. It's not a completely self-evident title, but it unfolds over time. So there's a lot of things that have sort of been revealed in the title after it was sort of chosen for me. But I'm happy with it. My folder on my computer is still titled The Quickening, and that's the way I remind myself of the original title, however. There's lots of illusions when we put nature next to scripture, and we put, basically we say that God did this, that opens up these explorations and these questions about even the role of gold. And gold has very special properties, and they knew some of those chemical properties, right? That it can be hammered out to very thin sheets that are just a couple atoms thick. Gold is special, and it even has a special origin. So I think we can look at the world, and I want to be able to, sort of juxtapose these two things, the way the word is used in the Bible and the way that the publishers wanted to use it to represent my book. And I think it's fun. That's kind of like chemistry, right? You're taking two different things and you're putting them together and seeing what happens. And so, I do appreciate all those allusions for the afar word. Yeah.
Okay. Good. Thank you very much, Fred. Cy, good to see you here.
Hi, Cy.
You may unmute yourself and let's hear your question.
Thanks, Randy. Hi, Ben. Good to see you. And I read your article, and I have to say right off the bat that I think it's not only brilliant, but revolutionary. I mean, I read that when I finished reading it, I thought, oh my goodness, now I have to think a lot. Which I'm getting tired of. I'm getting a little tired of doing that, but I do have a question here. I mean, I love the approach of looking at nature differently, as as novelty, as irreducible novelty, and I love this discussion about how that can really get us very close to the maker, to the creator, God. But I do have a question about that, and in one point there's a paragraph where I think you're quoting Hanby, and the quote is, "Were biologists to approach their subjects as one approaches a painting, it would no doubt transform the very meaning of science, restoring it to theoria in the traditional sense."
Mm-hmm.
Now, that's great. But my question is, if that's what we do, if that's our attitude, how do we do science?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, do we lose science?
Exactly. How do we explore reality if we're simply loving the beauty of the natural?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a wonderful question. And I do, Hanby, as a writer, I mean, he gave me the term irreducible novelty, which started me thinking along this road. As I read more of Hanby, I do find things in him that I disagree with, and things that are pointed in the right direction, but not categorically always true. And he's that kind of author. He's kind of a high risk, high reward kind of author. And I love that about him. But it does lead to conclusions like this, where I think he's a theologian. He's not a scientist. And so he doesn't really know about sort of the skeleton of science, the beauty of an equation, the kind of insight that you can get when you are led to something through math or replicatable experiments, and that you are that feels different than painting a painting, right? So I would take his comment as they are already scientists and they are learning to look at their work another way. And part of my goal is to train up students that have that backbone of science and then let them know, hey, you don't have to screen out the philosophy. You don't have to say it's all equations. But to be a scientist, you have to have some equations, some reproducibility somewhere in there, some mathematical backbone to be able to reduce the world to that way. So, yeah, I do think, but I like that quote, and I thought a little bit about, does that quote go too far? And I think if I had more than 8,000 words, I might have been able to qualify it a little bit. But I do want to keep it in because I think it's fundamentally true for the purpose of the article. The example at the end where I talk about a class that I teach, where we actually synthesize the pigments. Actually, I mentioned chrome yellow. I edited out the part that it was the class I teach. At the end, I talk about how chrome yellow was made by science, and then it unlocked Van Gogh to be able to paint his sunflowers. Well, that's from personal experience where I teach the students to make chrome yellow in a first year chemistry and art class that I put together since my book was published. And they put together the chrome yellow and then they make art from it just like Van Gogh did. And I suppose that's the way I take Hanby's quote. Science has to actually be science, and it's okay for it to be distinct. The whole idea behind juxtaposition, and this goes all the way back to Alistair McGrath's original discussion of natural theology. The things that you juxtapose have to be whole and intact in themselves before you juxtapose them. So there is a sense in which we need to have the science be whole and intact and self-consistent and communicatable to non-Christians. You know, it has to work as science, at least at a certain level. But then when we sit back and we look at our work, we can say, there's some beauty here. There's something that I can look at here, that I can look at this like a painting. And what I'm saying is when we do that, it's secondary to science, but it is just as real as my appreciation of the beauty of the original science. And we are made to do that. We're made to look at science like a painting, as well as for it to be intact and real science. I do think that my book sometimes comes under justifiable criticism because I do round off certain things, and I do try to describe. I do leave off certain things, and I don't think I have a mathematical equation in the book, although I do have some pretty mathematical graphs. So I try to deal with that thing in my book by making the graphs so that people can look at them and understand that, and maybe you can look at the graph like a painting once you know enough about it. But it does come down to there are some things that are in science that make it science that have to be in place for us to say that this science is like a painting before we go on and say it's like a painting. So yeah, it's one of the things that we're struggling with. What does it really mean to be science? And I wouldn't take Hanby's quote as 100% true in the sense of subsuming what science should be. It assumes that science is already there.
Okay, great. Thanks, Ben. That's very helpful. Joe, go ahead. Joe Lechner.
After today's talk, I have a new appreciation for the three wise men who say, we have come from afar.
We might want to pass that past a few more biblical scholars before publishing that one.
Yeah, it's not exactly what Fred was saying, was it? But that's a good one. That's a good one there. All right. That was your comment. Very timely and astute here. Good pun. Hello, Paul. Go ahead. Paul? No, you've got to unmute yourself, Paul. We can't read your lips that well. No, try again. There you go.
I don't know if you remember, we met at a Biologos outside of Seattle, where we both live and have association with UW and Fred Hutch. And we talked about the Discovery Institute and Stephen Meyer and the God of the Gaps thing. My question is what is your viewpoint on what's happening now? Are you in dialogue? Have you come together a little more, particularly in this era of political polarization and anti-science?
It's interesting. I would love to hear what Stephen Meyer or Collier is the one that I actually reviewed his book, although his book was a summary of other intelligent design arguments that were put together. So actually, that's one of the other things that feeds into this article. It was previous. Let's see, December 2021. I was asked to review the book by the ASA. And so I published my reaction to Collier's book, which is sort of a summary of intelligent design. So some of these, and that actually came before this. In that book review, of course, one of the terms I deal with, especially because it's so chemical, is the idea of irreducible complexity. I mean, that is specifically my area because it's specifically a protein structure argument and change over time argument. So I do address some of the specific arguments in that book review. So I'm trying to cram all of what I think into the 4,000 word book review or whatever it could have been. But in that, I felt like with that review, I said my piece, and I also talked specifically in that review. I want the ASA. I think the ASA should be a place where we all get together and discuss these things. So I'm grateful to have a chance to review the book in the sense of I really do want to engage these arguments, and I hope that we can, maybe the ASA has a role to play in this particular thing. I have reviewed the arguments. I am unconvinced by them. But when I was done with that review, I was thinking about it, and I was like, okay, irreducible complexity doesn't work for me. I've looked at the evidence. I don't think it comes together. I can't hang my hat on that. And yet I believe that not everything is reducible. Therefore, what is irreducible, specifically in my own book that I talked about, what is irreducible about it? And I was thinking about that when I came across Michael Hanby's original quote that called about, we don't have irreducible complexity, but we have irreducible novelty. Another theologian that helped me through this was John Milbank. He actually co-published a book that has a number of wonderful authors in it. And there are all sorts of connections between the science and faith world in surprising ways that come out through books like that. And I believe John Milbank co-edited the book about science and faith with Peter Harrison, who is fascinating perspective on the history of what we even mean when we say science and religion. What the words originally meant was much different than the way that we use them now. And that got me thinking about how can we recover the old meanings of these words. So basically, it actually does come, the whole reason why irreducible novelty even stands out to me is because I've been thinking about these things, thanks to the argument that were brought up by people proposing irreducible complexity. And so I just want to be very clear that I don't believe the argument, but I appreciate the chance to think through the issues, as long as we're all engaging them in good faith and representing things as clearly as we can, and being willing to be wrong, and things like that. So I'm trying to engage the topic the way I would like to be engaged, and so I would hope that the ASA can sort of be a meeting ground for these things. And I think that we aren't necessarily going to persuade people of other things, but I do think there's value in us just trying to see the thing from the other person's perspective, but being able to say at the end, no, I don't think I think that most complexity is actually reducible. Here's this other thing that I think is irreducible. It's not the same kind of thing as complexity. And it leads you into all these questions, but they are very old questions that we kind of have to work our way through from the standpoint of a commitment to faith, from the standpoint of saying Trinitarian theology, Jesus is God. Jesus, God, the Spirit, made the world according to a certain order, but also with a certain freedom. And so these aren't really new questions, but we get new science that we get to incorporate into these old frameworks, and that makes it new as well. So yeah, a big question, but it does have its roots. The very focus of my title has its roots in irreducible complexity. Yeah.
Okay, very good. Thanks, Paul. Terry.
Am I on?
Yes, you are. Go ahead.
Very good. I have first a comment and then a question that's actually closely related. I just wanted to say I very much appreciate your footnote 63, where you're here's the line you talk about, whether the origin of life is continuous with geochemistry or it's a discontinuous emergent miracle. And then you say, either way, the life produced is irreducibly novel. And I very much appreciated that notion of that you could have something that has some kind of continuity with, the physical chemical world, and then be novel in that. And I think that was the theme throughout. So that I wondered whether that should be in the text rather than in a little footnote. But the closely related idea, and you can comment on that if you want. But let me go ahead and ask the question here. On page 10, after the list of four biochemical, or the four chemical roles, you have this sentence: in each of these categories, life selected some elements with the proper solubility, but for chemical reasons, not others. And you get into more. And I was struck, and I want to challenge a little bit of the abstraction of life here, and just get you to maybe comment further on that, because I think from the previous footnote, life as it sort of emerges out of these phenomenon is and it's an emergent novelty, of course, but what is this life that's doing this selection when it's as you have it in your text, rather than life being sort of the result of the emergence of the aspects of life, based on the previous properties of the chemicals involved.
Right. Fantastic question. By the way, the ASA PSCF has certain limits. Articles can't be more than 8,000 words long, but there's a loophole. You can put as many footnotes as you want. I think there's probably a practical limit to that, but I probably pushed up against it. So yes, that was probably originally part of the article. I like the thinking about continuous versus discontinuous. It's also kind of mathematical that we can think about things that way. I mean, discontinuous versus continuous makes a difference mathematically, but there are also some functions, some purposes of math for which discontinuous versus continuous doesn't matter. And so the question is, when we're talking about these things, let's not get so involved in the debate of whether it is continuous or discontinuous to lose sight of the fact that something bigger is also going on. Mm-hmm. To get to your question exactly, I was hoping that I would get a little bit in trouble. I was sort of deliberately doing that. I realized as I was writing it that this kind of makes life into a selective agent. The reason why I did it is because R.J.P. Williams does it all the time. And so I feel like I was summarizing Williams. And so I wanted to be true to him. He even, the title of one of his books is The Natural Selection of the Elements. So I didn't want to get into natural selection, but natural selection as being a fundamental aspect of life. And I figured that I would sort of use Williams' way of looking at it and go for the abstraction in that case. And it definitely does exactly what you're saying. It takes what was previously discussed as an effect and turns it into a cause. But I think that's one of the threads that I've come to when looking at the whole book. Cause and effect are more complicated than we sometimes reduce them to. I do think that I would still write it that way, and I would follow R.J.P. Williams in doing that. And by the way, Williams, Alistair McGrath reports that at the end of his life, Williams was actually talking about, he was always officially an agnostic. But he says in a personal conversation, take it as a rumor, if you will, that Williams was saying, there's something funny about the whole universe. There's something that makes me feel like there's an order and there's a purpose and meaning behind it all. And it almost could make me believe in God or something like that. One of those kind of comments, not peer-reviewed, published, but reported by McGrath in some format somewhere. But all I can say is that this sort of pointed Williams to, I think, allowing agency to the entire abstraction of life points you in a way toward things that are irreducible. And so that's one of the reasons why, even though it's not really scientific, it's what Williams did. And I think it helped him as he was thinking these things through to sort of see that there are higher things, there's some sort of agency where before we didn't see agency. Now we can reduce that agency to a mechanism, natural selection, solubility, and things like that, chemical aspects. But I deliberately am sort of doing that. The other side to it is this is not really a new question of whether life is a cause or an effect of the natural world. And what is the role of choice and free will in this? This is one of those places where when I open up the old questions, the classical theism questions, there are some areas that align with that. And there's, I'm in a reading group right now. One of the things I love about being at SPU is that we can have reading groups on these old people, on these ancient writers. Nicholas of Cusa is actually quoted in my article. And we've had sort of a reading group of theologians and even artists. It shows up a biologist. And we read through these things like Nicholas of Cusa. Currently, we're reading through Gregory of Nyssa. And I never would have been able to read through these things on my own. But when I read these, I can actually see things that they say where they were confronting similar questions. Maybe not exactly the same question, but the question about what has agency and what doesn't. Now, I would not give life enough agency to be like humans. I would not say that life rises to that level, but I think there are some glimmers of what is all put together in us that might be discussed in terms of agency so that you can say life selected. That's a big amount of words that I'm doing to unpack two words, life selected, right? But that's the kind of things that I want to think about and explore with this writing. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Excellent. Thanks, Ben. Fred, you've got your hand up again.
Yes, yeah, so I know maybe I'm out of turn. If anybody else has a question, I yield to them, but I do have questions.
Okay, well, Ed, you can ask another. Go ahead.
Okay, so you talk about agency, and Terry talked about, does life select or does God select? It was the basis of it. In my mind, one of the most intriguing and maybe most important words that is in Genesis 1 is a word that isn't even there. And that's the word let. So there's no Hebrew word for let. It's used about 5 or 6 times in Genesis 1. And it actually can either mean like, oh, let our son use the car. In other words, he's on his own, I just give permission. Or it can mean let him have punishment, which is a command. And it ranges in its manner of use. And the interesting thing is it's more in the category of command when it's inanimate things, and it's more in the category of permission when it's dealing with life forms. Let the earth bring forth life, vegetation. That's more in the permission level. So what we see is a God who gives permission and also commands. So when people ask, okay, is it God's will or is it man's will? Or is it life's will? The answer is yes, it's both. And part of the paradox of understanding God is a really good manager, and he gives permission for the employees, humans and life forms, to do their thing. And the neat thing about genetics is he creates this life form that can respond to the environmental conditions and so on like that. So let is a very important word in my mind.
Yeah.
Your thoughts about that?
Yeah, it's also related to the picture that Jesus gives us of God as the Father, but the good Father, and the one who I think that the prodigal father is an image of what God is and lets us do. And as a father myself, I try to see the way to be a father is to look at God, and that's a lot of what Jesus was saying. The other thing that occurs to me is back to Genesis 1, you have the let this be, right? And then you get to the verses where humans are created. And what is it then? It's let us make humans in our image, right? And this is one of the things that Gregory of Nyssa writes about, so that's why it's on my mind. But the idea of this is the focus of God more than letting things be, but to make through a long, well, not necessarily a long process, but a process. Making implies some sort of process, probably. I mean, maybe that's a metaphor, but it certainly is different from let it be when it comes to the other things. And that is reflected, that sort of hands-on nature of creation of humans goes along with this same thing that you're saying, where, humans are the image of God because we have the fuller agency that's only in glimmers otherwise in creation, but we're made a little lower than the angels, right? And that is that's our place. This is why I love the classical theology tradition, because they, just like in the ASA, we're talking about these texts all the time, they've talked about them too. And just because they don't have the genes associated with DNA, they still know that traits are hereditable, right? That there are some things that are passed down from generation to generation, and some of that's physical and some of that's acquired, right? So they are, Gregory of Nyssa actually pointed that thing out, but I do think that the whole let it happen, and that God likes to work in that way, even in the parables of Jesus, is a good antidote to accusations that God is some kind of tyrant that's just controlling everything, like a control freak manager, right? Who's saying that everything happens and therefore is responsible for every bad thing that happens. Now, of course, there's other questions that come up if you follow that road down too much. But I do like this. There's a lot of the both and thinking that you're talking about. It's not new with us. The church fathers have always been thinking this way. It's just that they're hard to read unless you have a reading group, like I'm blessed to have, of theologians and people who actually read Greek to help you put their words into context. But it's really fascinating. And it helps me as a scientist know that people have been doing this and that there are some answers out there. You always have to filter through them too, because there's always going to be something wrong, something that you disagree with.
Right. Excellent. Good discussion. Thank you. Del, coming back with another one. Yes.
Hi, Del.
Yes, again, I'll defer if somebody new wants to come in
No, go ahead. Go ahead.
Any of yours with my third question. I'm kind of where I'm stumbling a little bit, and I like your discussion, and I'm going to say I essentially agree with, I'll say just about all of it. But where I'm stumbling is whether science, which is, and I'm using Aristotle's causes because they're at least fundamental and non-scientists know them, and if scientists don't, it's their fault for not knowing them. Is science going to be concerned only with efficient and material causes? And yet I think we all want to understand the universe, at least as Christians, and seeing God's causes, God's purposes in it. And that's going to bring in Aristotle's final cause and formal cause, focusing on final. Yeah. I wonder if we're trying too hard to make science support a final cause instead of accepting it as this is a subset of a totality of knowledge that there is. Mm. And I'll leave it at that without getting into, well, I will say, I think something like Aristotle's final causes and agency do have to come into play at some point in biology. Sunflower turning to the sun doesn't have agency. A cat talking to the bird, I will argue, does have an agency and final cause in it. But should we be looking to science to be the whole of things and not simply accept that this is, it's a partial, it's not the whole, mainly guarding ourselves against scientism? Your thoughts?
Well, one of the things that that is most seated in the article to me is Joseph Earley. You know, he's the real deal. He's one of the main philosophers of science. And I've really liked his writings because he's a real chemist, and yet he's a real philosopher. And his argument was that we've got to admit that we're talking about formal causes. You know, popular science especially, and this goes to all the way to the way social media communicates and assumes. We have this sort of popular assumption that science works, and science works because it's only about efficient cause, you know, and everything else comes from that. And again, this is not a new idea. You know, this is the whole Epicurean idea all over again. Lucretius and all those Greek philosophers. Paul argued against this idea when he was in Athens. So not new, but it's the perennial idea of the question of what is the role of these things. I wonder if Aristotle was ever reacting to these specifically when he proposed formal cause, but I'll have to think about that another day. Formal and final causes. Early allows me to say formal cause is truly scientific. In fact, you just might not recognize it, but when the mind aligns with matter and is able to put a name on matter, in a sense, Genesis 2, Adam naming the animals, is putting a name onto forms, recognizing forms, putting a name on them. And I think when you're recognizing a species or a chemotype, you are participating in a formal cause. And that's that shows that science is more than efficient cause. And then if you follow Aristotle, then you say, well, maybe there's more than final cause that science points to. And yet it's always incomplete. It's always going to be a point to, because science, as Cy pointed out, science is built on efficient cause explanations being put together. You are reducing the situation always, and at some level you have some sort of reproducibility or mathematical function that you're saying is underlying the whole thing, and that is efficient. You know, there's no getting around that. I'm actually Early's work on formal cause and pointing to final cause in itself says science is incomplete. There's a reason why science is always talking about efficient cause, and you know, I don't want it to stop, but I want it to be able to apply its findings from efficient cause to other things. When you get to other things, maybe you can have some glimmers of final cause. And I think in the article, there's some talk that way, but I don't mean to imply that there can be a fully scientific final cause. In fact, I think that possibly, and again, we'd have to look at Aristotle and really think about the philosophy. I'd have to talk to my philosopher friends because I couldn't do this alone. But the idea is Aristotle sort of saying that there's more to science in even talking about final cause? What I want to argue against is the people who argue from science that there is no final cause. And I think that all these causes, especially the final cause, which is where are we going, science can't see that because it starts from efficient cause and it can only sort of see the final cause at the end of the arrows that it sees, where they converge. There's always going to be a gap that always needs to be filled in. And I think that needs to be filled in by revelation, by basically God coming near. Otherwise, this is just the Tower of Babel all over again. It's like we're going to build this thing up from first causes, and then people be forced to believe final cause, you know? It doesn't work that way. So, yeah, I precisely want to argue against scientism in the sense of saying science can point in a certain direction, but the way it points, the farther away you get from efficient cause, you have to do it. But you have to also see that science can't get you all the way there. And that opens up a door for in the scientific, you know, sort of monism universe where everything's one thing, it opens up a door in that universe. And that's one of the things spiritually, actually, that I hope that my book can do sometimes, sort of open up a door to say, hey, we've got all these efficient causes, but they all have to go through forms, and then they are going in a direction. And once you have a direction, then you have a point where the arrow is pointing to. It's the final cause that you just glimpse. But it actually is one of those things that, again, these are categories that were by Aristotle, right? This does not require 20th century science to be able to do this, but it can help us interpret 21st century science, hopefully now, in that direction. So yeah, I want to say very clearly, final cause is important, and final cause can never be fully encapsulated by science. It can only be pointed to.
Let me push on that a little bit, Ben, just for clarification. So if science and its efficient causes can't quite cross that gap to the final causes, and we now have to think about glimpses of final causes, how do you do the validation of those glimpses? That is to say, if hypothetically you had two competing glimpses of the final cause, if science can't reach it, then don't you have to admit that there is no process of validation of evidentiary distinction between those competing glimpses?
This is actually a really important question, because when I'm looking around at, you know, like I said, I'm a father, so I'm very closely related to 20-some-year-olds and teenagers. And they seem to be caught in a world where they do have glimpses and lots of arrows, and they don't know how to put it together. And I've talked to other parents, and I think that this is one of the fundamental things that that the generation, the younger generation, is facing. And as a teacher of that younger generation, I want to sort of help them try to figure that out. So I will say that there is no fully scientific way to do it, but science can provide evidence, can help you decide, but it will never get you all the way there. At some point, you have to use your agency to commit with incomplete knowledge. On the other hand, you have other things outside of science. You know, God's helping us, God's here with us, and we are sort of, the Spirit will align our arrows if they're aligned properly. But this is something that deals with mind and not matter. And that's why the whole thing about agency and the whole thing about transcendentals, I think the transcendentals are selection algorithms. That's a really bad metaphor. But the transcendentals are ways for us to say, oh, this arrow goes together, this arrow from faith and this arrow from science, they go together in this way. And maybe I don't understand it all, but that seems true, beautiful, and or good. And it's good to make things with chemistry, you know. So I think that the transcendentals help address that problem of science can't really tell you which of the arrows that you think is there is the best arrow, you know. Lots of talk about arrows, but I'm just thinking of several kids who seem to be in this, and I felt it myself. You know, I don't want to say it's a new thing either. I just think it's exacerbated these days because there are so many arrows, so many people saying so many things are true, beautiful, and good. But I think that we can appeal to these categories and try to think through things as they've been thought through before. Classical theism can help.
Okay, so you're kind of admitting there is no real methodology for distinguishing your glimpse of that transcendental and perhaps mine if it differs.
It's irreducible.
Yeah, it's tough. Okay, well, we'll have to think about that. Terry, you got another question?
I was just going to comment and invite Ben's comment on what I'm saying here. But it seems to me that the irreducibility and the sort of novelty makes it fundamentally something that we can't predict and can't theorize to. Now, it may, God may know that ordering of things, but we don't, and we only discover it empirically as we actually see the novel thing or the whatever novelty in terms of properties, and thinking of life as say a novel feature of bringing different chemicals and physical substances together in new ways. Mm-hmm. We only address it sort of after the fact. It may not be predictable or theorizable to from the bottom up. We have to, view the reality, the phenomenon as it is. And I think, the language you use about, the novelty of certain things says that, predicts that. We have an expectation that we cannot necessarily get to the phenomenon from the bottom up, even though it might be derivable from the bottom up in the physical, chemical, biological world, because we don't see it. We don't have access to that full, if it's truly novel, then it's going to be something that we have to deal with after the fact, after we see the phenomenon to be existing.
What occurs to me is, remember way back at the beginning, I mentioned seeing the Challenger disaster. And I should have known, a big cloud, two little things coming out of it is not what usually you should expect. But it was a new experience for me. I literally did not see it until we went in and processed it and the implications over the following day with the help of my community, things like that. So this whole thing is about the mind has to be trained, and it's a process of being trained to see. A lot of the church fathers talk about this way, especially the ones in the Orthodox tradition. They talk about the processes of knowing and the processes of salvation by which God aligns us with and molds us and creates us to bring out the full image of God. They talk a lot about the image of God as Christ, and we are moving toward Christ. And so that's how they interpret the image of God, rather than something that is given to everyone as sort of a default thing that makes us human at the very beginning. Again, there's different ways to look at the image of God, but I've found this to be very helpful in thinking about things like processes. And I keep coming back to the gap between mind and matter, that there is some kind of, and Descartes dealt with this in a certain way. People who say that the mind is just an illusion deal with it in another way. How are we going to deal with this gap between mind and matter? But that's why I think that all these past resources are so helpful to asking these questions. And that fundamentally it comes down to when the mind recognizes something, there are some places where it's a deception, right? But there are some places where it's real, where it's God speaking to us and God aligning us with himself by our development and salvation over time. So I think there really is a theological angle to all of this. And because we cannot take apart God, we can never ultimately say that that's a scientific thing. And yet God allows us, God lets us be, lets us take some things apart that are below us, a little lower than the angels and looking down, that kind of thing. But this is just what occurs to me is how many of these questions you can resonate with if you can get into a good group that can help you read the people who have said this before. But it's hard. There's a lot going on, right? So.
Okay, got one more from Cy, and I'm going to put myself after Cy. I have a question, and that probably will bring us to a close because we only have a few minutes left. But Cy, let's hear your second question.
Well, it's a quick comment because the issue of final cause, which I like to use the word teleology, has come up. And this is something Randy and I have been arguing about for many years. But I just wanted to mention very quickly that a book has just recently been published called Evolution on Purpose, Teleonomy in Living Systems. And it's a collection of essays. It's edited by Peter Corning, Stuart Kaufman, Dennis Noble, James Shapiro. I'm not aware that any of those people are Christians. I think they're not. So what's happening currently in biology is that the prohibition against any mention of purpose, which has been in effect for some time, is starting to slide away. And it's sliding away not on the part of Christians, but on people who are really looking to push the borders of biological understanding beyond where they are now. And I would predict that, this is happening very quickly. Mm-hmm. And there are papers, there are many papers now are discussing the issue of teleology and agency in biological organisms. So stay tuned because things are changing quick.
Yeah, thanks for that recommendation. I was able to glance it out. Yeah, and it mentions, and Terry says in the chat, Kaufman is actually quoted in chapter 12 of my book. And so that's why I sort of allow myself to finally say a little bit, show my cards, right? And I do like what Kaufman has to say. Addie Pross is another author of that book who is a chemist,
right,
and has wonderful things to say. What's also interesting about this is I follow another set of chemists who they really don't like Dennis Noble and Shapiro and things like that. And the issue in that case, I'm thinking of the junk DNA guy. Can't remember his name. Larry Morin. He has a whole blog called Sandwalk. Yeah. But he's really dug in on the whole junk DNA thing. And so it's interesting to me because it's kind of like, it's a little bit like, get our popcorn and watch sparks fly. But we're participating in this too, right? And I do think that there is an openness in some parts of the scientific community to the things that we and our traditions, and basically God has to say here. And that's exciting. And I do recommend Pross especially. I need to get back to see what's been happening lately in that corner. And then I see this reaction of this other group of scientists saying, oh, those aren't real scientists. That isn't real science. And I don't want that to fracture and blow up, but I think there's going to be some sparks there as people like Moran dig in their heels.
Oh, yeah.
Perceive as the false teleonomy or teleology.
Teleology.
Right. Yeah. What tele something. Final cause. Yeah.
Right.
But basically, is final cause an illusion or not? It's really the old question. Was Epicurus right?
Mm-hmm. So. Right. Okay. Thank you, Cy. So I get the last question, don't I, as a host? Okay. So I'd like to hear you explore a little bit more this issue of emergence and your irreducible novelty and some of the comparisons. You have a number of references to it, and I appreciate that. I'm a big fan of emergence, if we could all figure out what it really means. But I keep thinking of a discussion at a BioLogos meeting that took place, I don't know, probably 12, 13 years ago at Mohonk, Maybe some of you were there. It was a fascinating meeting. I enjoyed it a lot. And one of the things I remember is a small group discussion on emergence at that point. And I had just begun thinking and being aware of emergence at the time, so I didn't participate in the discussion, but I remember what was discussed. And one of the issues there, a philosopher whose name escapes me, and I just know that he's passed away. He's no longer alive, and I hope I can remember it. But the philosopher was pushing back on the idea of emergence by making the following distinction. He was drawing a distinction between the emergence from components, the emergence of properties versus the emergence of ontological entities. And in particular, can there be an emergence of ontological entities, which means having the ability to influence the components, you know, the feedback system, the up-down kind of feedback. And as illustration, he said, look, think about water. If you simply look at H2O molecule itself and you try to extract the properties from that, you're really not going to derive the properties of water. So in a sense, the wetness that you get in water is an irreducible novelty. But he would say that is a property, that's not an ontological entity. So he was pushing for more understanding of, can there be an emergence of ontological entities? And now my view since then, I've thought a lot about that. And I think from my own field of solid state physics, yeah, there are a lot of examples of ontological entities that do have an influence back on its components. So I'd like to just hear your comments on this notion of the irreducible novelty. Is that something that is broader and encompasses all of the above, emerging properties as well as ontological entities, or is there a little different connotation here? How would you position this notion of irreducible novelty?
Yeah, I would say there's some people that solve that problem by saying there's some sort of panpsychism, that there's a little bit of soul in everything, right? And so the water does actually have some ontological agency that we just described with our equations. I don't think as a Christian that I have to go there, and there's a lot of questions that it raises for me. So I don't agree. I do agree that there is a distinction between ontological property or emergent properties and emergent ontological entities. I would say that the difference is the exact difference that we've been talking about, the difference between mind and matter. The truly ontological, that mind is something ontologically different and new, and yet our bodies are maybe they're on the property side of things. And so but we are integrated, our bodies and minds are integrated. And how does that work? I do not have the answer to that. But I do want to say that drawing from the classical theism, one of the things to say is mind is really ontologically different somehow. And so at some point there is an ontological, and there was a development of necessity that led up to the body and the brain. And we can even connect that down to chemistry in certain ways. And yet we have this, each of us has this unified mind, this unified perspective. And I want to say that's not an illusion. That's not an expression that's everywhere and just more concentrated in us. I think that is a real ontological difference that was reflected in Genesis 1, let us make humans in our own image. And I also want to say that I only say that because I've read it from the the classical theisms and the Orthodox Church Fathers. The Cappadocian Fathers are actually what I'm reading through right now. So I do want to say, yeah, and therefore there's a difference between the chemistry emergence, the chemistry novelty, and the novelty that our mind sees. But the recognition of that new property of water is an alignment of the mind with the world, and they were made to go together. They can only align truly because they were made to go together. And that's how I address that. I do want to say mind is a fully different category than matter, and that's an ontological gap that I feel like my theology has led me to restate and reaffirm that. So we'll talk about that. Yeah. Right.
Yeah, no, I think this is cool. And Becky, you're still there. If you could put in the chat the link to the discussion forum for this topic, I'd like to see some continuing discussion here, because it seems to me that the reason by which, as you say, the mind is made from matter, or matter, the two are together. But it seems to me the most logical explanation for that is that the mind emerges from the matter.
Mm-hmm.
And with that, it's 3:30.
Yeah, exactly.
It's, right. So
we haven't solved the problem?
We haven't quite solved the problem yet, but this is a great discussion. So let me thank all of you for attending and participating in the discussion. Ben, I thank you for a fascinating article, one which deserves to be read again and again and again, and I hope we can stimulate more discussions of this type. So everyone, tune in next month for Graham Finley's book, God's Gift of Science. And with that, I'll say farewell.
Thank you all.